Good evening. I'm calling the Monday, February 8th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting to order. Will everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. First item on the agenda tonight is the approval of tonight's agenda. Do you have any requests for changes? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion to approve the agenda.
A motion.
I second the motion.
Motion from Commissioner Farr and a second from Commissioner DeSanctis. Julie, would you like a roll call on the approval of the agenda? Okay. All those in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Agenda's approved this evening. Next up, we have approval of minutes from the meeting held on Monday, January 11th, 2021. Do you have any requests for edits or concerns? Or not seeing.
Chairman, move to approve.
All right. Motion from Commissioner Kirk. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Commissioner Higgins. All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right. Minutes are approved. Moving on, we have no public hearings this evening, and we'll go right into a planner's report. This is Housing Task Force Recommendations Update. Julie, we kick it off.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, Jonathan Stanley, who is the Manager of Housing and Community Services for the City of Eden Prairie, is here to present the findings and recommendations from the Housing Task Force. The City Council convened a Housing Task Force a bit over a year ago, and those folks were appointed by the City Council, and they met for a variety of, there were 12 task force members, and they met 16 times during 2019 and 2020. Their work has been completed, and Mr. Stanley has presented their findings and recommendations to the City Council, I believe, in last October. So after that presentation and acceptance of those findings, the city staff is working to implement those recommendations. As a part of that, we wanted to present the information to the Planning Commission as well, because there might be some amendments to the city code or other items that come before you that may feed upon some of those recommendations and implementation strategies. So the information that Mr. Stanley is sharing with you tonight is for your information, and he'll be able to answer any questions that you might have. And certainly if you have any questions for planning staff, we'll be happy to try and answer those as well.
Thank you.
Oh, excuse me. Just trying to share the presentation here. Give me a second. There we go.
Welcome and good evening.
Good evening.
Would you like questions as you go, or would you rather still wait to the end?
I think we can take them as they go.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So over online, maybe if, just ensure you're muted so we don't pick up any feedback during it, but if you want to raise your hand or jump in if you have questions, feel free to do so.
So good evening, Mr. Chair and Commission members. As Julie said, I'm Jonathan Stanley, the Housing and Community Services Manager for the City of Eden Prairie. I was also the staff liaison for the Housing Task Force. Julie did a great job describing kind of the components of it, the size of it. It was headed by Joan Howe-Polis as our chair. And it was a pleasure working with these folks from diverse backgrounds over the course of a year plus. So one thing that I thought was really kind of inspiring with this group was they locked onto the city's comp plan as a very needed guiding document. They wanted their goals and recommendations to be a rough match with what the city has articulated in its comprehensive plan. And they pulled out this great quote: "Housing is the foundation of any community. It helps to determine the health and vibrancy of a community." Some of the main task force policy and focus areas were inclusionary housing, which I've spoken actually to this body once before, regarding an affordable housing trust fund, naturally occurring affordable housing preservation, tenant protection ordinances, senior housing, housing opportunities in proximity to new public transit, communication strategies, and then what was kind of labeled the catch-all out-of-the-box strategies. And I'll be talking about the first 4 or 5 of these in more detail than some of the rest of them, as they spent the bulk of their time addressing those first few that you see on this list. So inclusionary housing, the task force felt that it served goal 1 in the comprehensive plan, the housing section, which is to incentivize attainable and affordable housing options for lower income households so they can move to and remain in Eden Prairie. This is a kind of the wow you chart here. There's a lot here, but I'll go through it as conveniently as possible. So the task force made recommendations in both the multifamily and the single family domain. You really hear inclusionary housing being talked about mostly as a multifamily enterprise, but the task force did feel that it was important that there be something contributed by all development in Eden Prairie, something either financial or built units, of course. So these recommendations would be triggered by requests for a planned unit development, a zoning or a comp plan change, or when there's city financial assistance. Of course, if we do adopt a policy or certainly an ordinance, then that would be a trigger as well. But this is what we're working with now, in addition to the fact that we've built inclusionary housing as a concept into our comprehensive plan. The project types, they felt strongly that it should apply to new rehabilitation and redevelopment properties for which the trigger is met. One slight disappointment for me was that we never quite got to the root of what rehabilitation inclusionary housing strategy would look like. You know, it's typically done on new developments, but I think that's an area to look into more broadly. The task force toggled on the development size a little bit. We started out with 10 units, then went to 20, then went to 15 after getting some feedback from developers and some other internal staff. And the inclusionary unit requirement for multifamily, this is something that was the staff recommendation and then was adopted by the Housing Task Force. We heard from developers as well as from the Planning Commission that developers like choice. So this matches actually the City of Brooklyn Park's strategy and is roughly similar to other peer communities in the region. But the developer would take a choice of 5% of units affordable at or below 30% of AMI, or 10% affordable at 50% or below of AMI, or 15% at 60% of AMI. So the developer takes a choice there. On the single family side, the developer option was 10% at 120% of AMI, but with a buyout option, or what's often referred to as a payment in lieu, because we recognize that the cost of land in Eden Prairie makes developing single family product at these lower AMI levels pretty difficult. So they felt strongly that there should be some payment in lieu there to be determined by the city. And then the term, Eden Prairie has been very unique in that we've been striving and negotiating with developers to get our inclusionary units in perpetuity, which were the only, by far not the only community in the country that has adopted that, but in the region we're the only ones that have done that. I think Minneapolis has the second longest term, which is at 30 years. But the task force did hear, we heard loud and clear from a couple of prominent local developers that in perpetuity was quote unquote a non-starter. So while we've had success as a city in negotiating this into development agreements, the task force ultimately concluded that after a certain period of time, perhaps the developer could buy out of those requirements. So if they had intentions, for example, to sell the building, they could either sell it with that encumbrance on the units or choose to buy out of that and then sell it free and clear from those inclusionary requirements. Again, the terms of that would be determined at a future date by the city. So the task force's recommendation for inclusionary housing was to adopt and enforce an Eden Prairie inclusionary housing policy. The task force also felt very strongly that the city should encourage multifamily developments to be comprised of 100% affordable units. I'm entering my third year here in my position, so I'm not privy to the entire history of kind of the council's stance on this, but we, for a while, were trying to integrate some market rate into all affordable developments and some affordable into all market rate developments. The task force looked at the case of Trail Point Ridge, which is a common bond project here now in Eden Prairie, and felt that the market rate units weren't really getting us what we needed. That, you know, the need as articulated in the comprehensive plan and as articulated by the Metropolitan Council for our 2030 goals, that we really need to get those affordable units at any cost. Task force also recommended that landlords be required to accept tenant-based rental assistance, that's typically referred to as housing choice or Section 8 vouchers, for affordable housing created pursuant to the policy. So for those inclusionary housing units, they would have to agree to accept that as a valid form of payment. And then finally, they recommended that developers provide and follow affirmative fair housing marketing plans for developments to which the inclusionary housing policy applies. An affirmative fair housing marketing plan is creation of HUD. A lot of projects that go through the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and receive funds from them are required to complete these plans. In essence, it's a articulation of local media sources that you're going to advertise in to reach those least likely to apply. It's basically just an outline of how your marketing efforts will help reach low-income people of diverse backgrounds. The second area is a affordable housing trust fund, and this fell under Goal 2, which is to work in partnership with private and public sectors, regional, state, and federal agencies and citizens, community groups, and others to help envision and finance innovative housing demonstration projects and housing development. And that is indeed a mouthful. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund concept, it's basically a repository for funds that can come from a variety of sources, initially seeded by some city leverage, and then can take in philanthropic funds, funds from businesses, can combine a host of different city resources, and then have sort of a flexible deployment mechanism. So I think St. Louis Park has done this really well. They have like a 2-page sheet explaining their Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It states all the sources that can go into the fund and then all the uses that can come out of it. And with that, they can, you know, really get the word out there to developers, the types of things that they're interested in pursuing, the various activities that might fall under the policy, et cetera. So the task force strongly recommended that the creation of the Affordable Trust Fund and further suggested that the fund be general and flexible. Again, not trying to hem ourselves into any particular activities. So, for example, this could be new construction, this could be rehabilitation, it could be redevelopment, it could be first-time home buyer loans. Any number of activities could fall under this Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There's also been some state legislation that's proposed matching of these affordable housing trust funds at the local level, and so that's another attractive reason to have one in place. The task force also recommended that Eden Prairie staff explore its options, including a possible partnership with the Eden Prairie Community Foundation or other third parties. I think that the general thought there was that there's not only more community involvement maybe through the foundation, but there's also some fundraising and strengths of that nature. The city at present is planning to create an affordable housing trust fund or explore it further in our 2021 work plan, but looking at it more at the city level because we've had these types of funds before. We know kind of how our development processes work and we have the kind of mechanisms to figure out when and where we want to invest. But we're certainly not ruling out some type of partnership there, particularly again as they can have, you know, certain fundraising advantages. The third area is naturally occurring affordable housing, which I'm sure everyone on the commission has heard about. This is private unsubsidized housing or previously subsidized housing that's timed out of its affordability period. And the goal from the comp plan that fit here was addressing aging housing stock to preserve and prevent the decline of naturally occurring affordable housing. So the first key in getting at a NOAA strategy is to understand what properties in your community fit the definition that you create. Most cities have gone with some percentage of units in an existing building being affordable at a certain level of AMI. So for example, I think St. Louis Parks says it's any building where at least, I think it's 18% of units are affordable at or below 60% of AMI. And then they get data in where they can validate which buildings have rents that fit that structure, and then they would qualify that as a NOAA property under their city policy. So the first recommendation is to identify and document the potential NOAA properties. And then this really sets you up to be able to reach out to those multifamily owners and kind of get a sense of their intentions. Are they talking with, capital investors? Are they contemplating a different use for the building or a upbranding of the property, for example? So getting a sense of that owner intent is the task force felt was very key. And then developing partnerships and processes with nonprofits that work on large, medium, and small NOAA developments. As many of you may have heard, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund was kind of the leader in this area. They raised an initial fund of $25 million. At the end of the day, that doesn't help secure a lot of properties, but it is a meaningful investment. Aon, the developer, has been involved in this, and I think Common Bond is also working on some NOAA strategies. So building those relationships and understanding what they classify as a NOAA property and the types of characteristics that they'd need to see to invest in the purchase and conveyance to a mission-oriented nonprofit for management and ownership of the building long-term. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit there. Good relationships with these nonprofits is key because, again, the city doesn't have limitless resources to invest in saving these properties. And then the task force did something kind of unusual, which was to consider, have the city consider the identification of single-family homes, which are affordable by virtue of price and condition as part of the NOAA approach. This was the first time I ever heard anyone really discussing NOAA properties on the single-family side or owner-occupied side. And this, I'm not quite sure how we would operationalize it, and I'm not sure that there aren't other mechanisms that the city uses. For example, a community land trust, which we invest in every year to get affordability long-term in single-family homes, or even our home rehab loan program, which my office operates, that we might already be kind of serving the single-family side to the best of our ability anyway. So this merits some further investigation. And then one unfortunate reality of the NOAA kind of explosion, we've seen a number of properties change hands here in Eden Prairie, go through that sort of upbranding process, and there can be really deleterious consequences for the low-income households that occupy those properties. So,
Sorry, could I interrupt? Do you want?
Please.
Would everyone online, would you mind just making sure you're muted? We're picking up a lot of feedback or ruffling. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So as I was saying, a tenant protection ordinance is something to basically lessen the blow when these properties are sold and folks are facing possible displacement or other, high rent increases, things of that nature. So a number of communities in our area have adopted these. Bloomington has one, St. Louis Park has one, I think Golden Valley has one. But this fits under the first goal of incentivizing attainable and affordable housing options for low-income households to remain in Eden Prairie. So the task force recommends adopting a tenant protection ordinance triggered by the sale of a multifamily rental property. They further recommend that Eden Prairie provide each tenant a written notice of tenant's rights at the time that a lease or a lease extension is signed. We had a visit from some residents of Columbine Townhomes during our process, and we heard just too many folks saying, when there's a problem in our building, we don't even know who to talk to. There's a information gap that needs to be solved. So this would be some independent documentation of tenants' rights. The task force also contemplated leveraging other inspections of rental properties to incorporate inspections into kind of a short notice process. This is something that HUD and the Housing Finance Agency have been trying to do is cut down on the number of overall inspections, but leverage the information that is gained through those inspections so that you can take quick action on these issues. So as I mentioned, here are some of the communities that have enacted tenant protection ordinances. Typically, these have a period of 90 days. So for 90 days, types of protection would include prohibition on rescreening tenants. You can't just come in, buy the building and say, oh, those criteria that got you into the building are no longer valid. They're more strict now, for example. No prohibition on substantial rent increases. So for 90 days, you can't come in and just absolutely skyrocket the rents. Evictions would be allowed only for cause, and then there would be timely required notice of sale to tenants in the city. Unfortunately, tenants are often kind of the last ones to know in this process. So here's another chart. The proposed definition for applicability of the tenant protection ordinance would be any multifamily rental property of at least 4 units, where at least 20% of units are at or below 80% of area median income. Tenant protection period would match those other communities, 90 days. The new ownership would be prohibited from rescreening of tenants based on new rental eligibility criteria, eviction without cause, such as non-payment of rent, and forcing material changes to existing leases. Task Force felt very strongly that we needed to do better in communicating in a variety of languages. And then the fine for violation of this policy would be payment to affected low-income tenants of 3 months' rent, paid within 30 days if the tenant terminates the lease or the day that the tenant vacates if the owner terminates. We ran into one problem, which is that our city attorney has come to the conclusion that because we're a Class B statutory city, we can't prohibit rent increases, as that could be construed as a form of rent control. Obviously, raising of the rents would be one of the probably more likely things that the owner might seek to do. And because we can't prohibit that, it does mean that a tenant protection ordinance enacted in Eden Prairie would have a little less teeth to it than they do in these other communities where they can prohibit that substantial rent increase. Again, the task force recommended a tenant's rights document, which was to be widely distributed, articulating both the tenant's and the landlord's rights and responsibilities, including information on the tenant protection ordinance if enacted, and then also including legal and advocacy organization information for referrals. And that kind of fits in with the overall communication strategy that the task force envisions. Senior housing, of course, with aging demographics, is an area that the task force wanted to think about. This fits goal 3 of promoting senior housing opportunities that increase housing choices and enable seniors who choose to downsize their homes to age in community. The task force actually felt that the market was serving multifamily demand for senior housing fairly well, that it had 600 plus senior rentals and 100 for sale units since 2002, which is, I think, higher than our affordable production during that same period, although we're catching up, I think. They encourage staff to keep senior needs in mind when working with developers, but the focus of the task force was not on new production, but on helping keep seniors in their homes, which is an increasingly popular theme in the senior housing domain. So task force recommends that the city create and distribute a list of resources for seniors to utilize assistance in maintaining and converting properties to senior-friendly spaces. A lot of times it's not necessarily the cost of the housing, but it's just that it doesn't quite fit the needs of the resident anymore. But the goal would be to help seniors age in place with preservation of properties and conversion to more senior-friendly units, working on connecting seniors with existing resources, and creating and widely distributing listing of resources through the senior center, community center, prop, faith-based organizations, etc. Task force also strongly recommended that the city explore other recommendations in this report that can benefit seniors, and there are a few areas where that could occur, and that the city work with Proper and other local nonprofit to test the feasibility of running a home share program, which was something that was new to me. It's in essence just encouraging seniors to co-live in a particular home. The task force felt that it should be mandated that developers of senior housing accept elderly waivers, which is sort of the elderly equivalent, roughly, of a housing choice voucher. Create senior-centric units in developments near the light rail transit investments, and then work with a nonprofit to test feasibility of home share program in Eden Prairie. Task force also felt that there was room to work with Habitat for Humanity to participate in what's called the Age Well at Home program, which again is designed to help seniors convert their existing living spaces to be more senior friendly. The task force, of course, focused on housing opportunities in proximity to new public transit investments. This fits goal 5 of the housing section of the comp plan. They kind of endorsed a relatively simple statement here. It's pretty general, but in the development of land adjacent to the proposed light rail, the city should consider developing partnerships and integrating other services to effectively create housing and development opportunities that take advantage of this unique opportunity. They focused a fair amount on things like density bonuses or parking incentives, other things that could offset the cost of the affordability that's trying to be built into these new properties. So that's another factor that they looked at. In the communications domain, this fits goal 2 of working in partnership with private and public sectors, regional, state, and federal agencies and citizens to help envision and finance innovative housing demonstration projects and housing development. So the task force really recommended that the city's communication department and the Office of Housing and Community Services implement a communication strategy associated with affordable housing and the recommendations herein to create buy-in from the community and movement forward. This is, in essence, basically a campaign to eliminate NIMBYism or even the banana phenomenon, build absolutely nothing, adjacent to anything, or something of that nature, nowhere near anything. And then in the additional strategies to consider section, I won't read this goal again, but that these fell under that. The task force recommended to seriously investigate various strategies relating to housing in the community, including particularly accessory dwelling units, often sometimes called granny flats or mother-in-law apartments. We do currently in the city allow accessory dwelling units to be contained in a single building. This is taking that a step further and recommending that you could actually have smaller residents elsewhere on the property, obviously conforming with the city's aesthetic design standards and things of that nature. We mentioned the home share programs. Micro homes was another strategy discussed. Here talking not necessarily about tiny houses, but about very small multifamily units. They're working in some cities. Millennials are showing a tendency to be willing to live in smaller units and things of that nature. Continuing the work of land trusts is certainly a recommendation. We had one Eden Prairie resident who came to several of our meetings and works a lot in Minneapolis. The kind of stigma around single room occupancy, or what's referred to as SRO housing, is on the wane a little bit, and people are starting to look at that as a realistic model again, where of course you have your own unit, but you might share kitchen space and bathroom space. Units supporting large families is something that the city, obviously keeps in mind when considering new developments. And then they flirted with zoning, but it wasn't necessarily their wheelhouse or my wheelhouse. So they thought about zoning strategies as a way to build in more affordability in the community. In terms of next steps, the city has built into its 2021 work plan the inclusionary housing policy, the naturally occurring affordable housing strategies, which will be ongoing, and the affordable housing trust fund as work items for 2021. And that's the end of my presentation. I'll take any questions or comments.
Great. Thank you. Questions from the commissioners?
Mr. Commissioner DeSantis. Can you hear me?
I can.
The earlier slide about the Class B status of the city and the restriction on rent increases could be construed as rent control, according to the city attorney. Is that a legal opinion? Number one. And number two is, how did the city achieve that Class B status?
I think the city was just chartered as a Class B statutory city. It's an element of the city's functions that I don't understand particularly well, but my understanding is cities are designated one type of city, Class A or Class B statutory or charter cities at their enactment. In terms of the opinion, I don't know if I should call it exactly a legal opinion. The city attorney wrote up a memo regarding that opinion, so I guess it is a legal opinion of sorts, and feels fairly strongly that we can't, again, do anything that could be called some form of rent control. So our ability to affect rents at the local level, she feels is marginal.
Other questions from the commissioners?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Commissioner.
I have a question. A lot of great time and resources have gone into this study, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Stanley. Is it possible for a city like ours to take these recommendations and actually put them on paper with sites within our city that are on the horizon for implementation, and literally design a solution as bait for a developer to come and build this?
That's an excellent question, and one I certainly would want to work with Julie on as a first priority. But you know, I think there's various cities kind of take a different approach to development. You know, trying to be specific about sites and market sites in a certain way, lure developments, and trying to get some competition between developers, while others are a little bit more passive in that regard. I think what you're talking about, we're starting to kind of see in some of the light rail areas where, you know, we're getting inquiries day after day from developers about specific parcels. A more comprehensive articulation of that and really trying to kind of sketch it all out. I guess the task force didn't think too closely about how best that would suit the city. Although they did have a little bit of frustration, I'd say, that we weren't able to kind of foster more competition around certain sites and things of that nature. Like you might be able to if you owned a parcel, for example, and can basically say to the development community, sharpen your pencils, give us your best idea here. So it's an intriguing question. Julie certainly knows a lot more than I do, as does the commission, I'm sure, about guiding and planning for sites like that. So,
Because I'm thinking just the opposite of rent control would be if we zoned a parcel or imposed so many restrictions upon it financially that the sales price would have to drop to make it a developable opportunity.
sure.
So the inverse might happen, and I didn't know about the legal risk of that, right, in the market.
Right.
Okay.
Other questions from the commissioners online?
I can offer a comment more than a question. There is or was a affordable housing work group that grew together out of concerns that I've been a part of back before I joined the planning commission. And I can see some of those concepts that we try to other cities, as well as some of the needs for even. So I think this is a very worthwhile effort that was undertaken.
Thank you.
For what it's worth, I did listen to a seminar about a year ago on some of those housing options where they have sleeping units separate and then shared
Right.
common areas.
Yeah.
And they talked about the pros and cons and how there's different models going around the country. And, you know, that is so innovative, and there seems like the success factor is high enough, and I haven't seen it anywhere in the Twin Cities yet.
Sure.
I would suspect that Eden Prairie would be a great breeding ground to try something like that. And just for what it's worth, I think it's been done enough so that we can look at track records and dive into it a little bit deeper.
Gotcha.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah,
Very nice, and thank you for leading all that important work for us.
I
Appreciate it.
appreciate it.
Julie, did you have any other planners reports tonight?
No, sir.
All right. Members' reports. Not seeing any. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
This is Marcus. I'll make a motion.
All right. Motion from Commissioner Marcus. Do I have a second to adjourn?
Mr. Gooding, I'll second it.
I think it's Commissioner Gooding. All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Julie.
What is our, what's our limit of the number of